Good morning, everybody. A warm welcome from the European Movement's office here in Brussels on a beautiful sunny day. For those of you who might not be familiar with the European Movement, we are a network of organizations set up 70 years ago to promote European cooperation and integration. At the moment, we have a presence throughout Europe, and we bring together all sides of society to discuss how better to work together and promote a common future for all Europeans. And to do that, we organize a whole host of activities, not least online discussions like this one. And to kickstart this series of digital conversations together with the European Commission, we have invited one of the experts in the EU institutions on communications. Pia Ahrenkilde Hansen is the Director General of DG Communications. She has a long career in communications, having been previously the Chief Spokesperson for the European Commission. And at the moment, she is leading the efforts of the European Commission to communicate with citizens and stakeholders around Europe about what the EU does and how it helps Europeans. Pia, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having invited me, and delighted to be with you this beautiful morning indeed in Brussels, as you were saying, Petros, and with all the interested who are listening to us right now, and I hope they are many.
Indeed, indeed. Now, we have people joining us from around Europe. This is broadcast on Facebook, on YouTube, and of course on Twitter. So you will be able to ask your questions too, and we will be trying to respond to as many of them as possible. But if I may start with one myself, Pia, we are obviously going through a particularly challenging time. The health crisis that we are confronted with has challenged us all in many ways. And the Commission has been first in reacting and addressing that challenge. Would you mind giving us a few examples of how the EU has been responding and what the Commission has been doing to help Europe through the current crisis?
I'd be very pleased to do so. As you say, it has indeed been and it remains a very challenging period for all of us and for everyone, all the people in Europe, indeed, who are also looking not only to member states, but of course also to Europe to provide solutions as we are facing this unprecedented crisis that, of course, started like a health crisis, an unprecedented one as well. And that, of course, is having some very important also social and economic impacts. And on all those levels, in addition to everything that member states are doing as, of course, the first responder to a health crisis, Europe is supporting member states in the crisis. And yes, I'd be happy to explain a little bit how we have tackled it as we have gone through the different phases of the crisis. Of course, when we first addressed the crisis as in the immediate crisis response phase, where member states were tackling the immediate health impacts and getting the health response in order. Of course, the EU's role was one primarily of coordination, and it was a natural reflex, of course, for member states to try to protect people on the ground, to try to cater to their own citizens. And our role in the European Union, and indeed in the Commission in particular, was to ensure that the response could become more coordinated than it was in the beginning, where indeed the instincts and the reflexes to cater for one's own needs at the member state level were the first reaction. So the coordination was the first thing that we needed to do to make sure that there were no or not too many negative impacts, spillovers of the response that was taken by member states on one hand, and then of course also supporting where it was possible with the means that we have and the competences that we have in the health area to get the relief, to get the protective equipment where it was most needed. It also involved getting keeping Europe's infrastructure running, because otherwise, what did we risk? We risked putting not only in danger the vital flows of equipment that needed to reach the hardest hit countries in Europe, but also to make sure that we could keep the internal market open for essential goods. So in that phase, apart from, of course, policy being very focused on the policy response, and policy and communication, of course, need to go hand in hand. Our communication was also focused on visualizing in the best possible way the solidarity that was displayed by member states on one hand, and coordinated and indeed also supported through financial means by the European Union, for example, through emergency instruments, for example, by our civil protection mechanism, where we also facilitated the repatriation of Europeans who got stranded and, of course, who had difficulties getting back home. So hundreds of thousands of Europeans were helped in this way. And we worked hard to show, indeed, both the health response and the support that Europe was able to provide in that context, and also how we were very directly assisting Europeans, bringing them back home, for example. That came in addition to the alleviation of economic measures, something that is perhaps a little bit harder and more challenging to visualize, but which was extremely important for member states' ability to respond, namely when we introduced through a temporary state aid framework the possibility for, indeed, member states to put together these vital economic packages that could alleviate the economic and social impacts, the immediate ones, in addition to also waiving the so-called escape clause that enables the member states to go higher in terms of their public spending, precisely to alleviate the immediate impact of the crisis. So that was kind of the first phase in our crisis response. So, like in the member states, a very reactive one. And then we moved a little bit more to get in control of the situation. Again, also mirroring what was happening in the member states throughout the lockdown period, planning ahead also how we would go about responding to the crisis, both in policy and communication. And I could give many examples, but let me just give you one. The EU's global response that I'm sure you followed, Petros. It was a pledging marathon that was initiated by our president, who has been, I would say, the top crisis manager in the Commission, with her coronavirus response team from the very early days of the crisis, and day by day managing the crisis. But on the at the end of April, beginning of May, we put together, and this was the President's initiative, this EU global response, trying to fill the funding gap globally, as we were looking for both testing, treatment, and diagnostics. So, and of course, the vaccine that everyone needs to finally beat the virus. And there we hosted this pledging marathon that provided almost 10 billion of pledges from donors worldwide, including, by the way, 1.4 billion from the Commission itself. So a very, let's say, proactive initiative that shows that we really want to make sure that vaccines get accessible to everyone. Vaccines are a public good. So this was one initiative, in addition to, of course, all the individual decisions and measures that we took from the outset of the crisis. And you won't believe it, but actually we are beyond 380 81 decisions and 13 legislative measures already in the crisis. So it's quite an important number. But of course, the effect is what is important. So alleviating the health impacts, alleviating the social and economic impacts, and making sure that we address not only the impacts in Europe, but also show solidarity globally. I would say those were the most important strands of action that we as the European Commission took on behalf of the European Union. And now I would say, as we are moving through the exit phase, as we have seen, many member states are also lifting their controls at the borders, for example. Very clear evidence also of the changes that we are undergoing in the phases of the crisis. Also something that we have tried to coordinate very strongly to ensure that it happens in a smooth and mutually, let's say, reinforcing way in terms of the positive impact that all this has, without jeopardizing citizens' safety, because protecting the lives and livelihoods of citizens has been and must remain the overriding priority in managing this crisis. Now we're moving through the exit phase that we also indeed set out guidance for at an early stage, so that member states indeed could address the exit in a coordinated, although in a differentiated way. Now, of course, we are heading fast towards what needs to happen in terms of enabling Europe to recover and indeed repair all the very, very, very important impacts of the crisis, both in terms of social impacts, jobs, and the economy as a whole. And there we have put on the table, as you know, a very important recovery plan that is designed to help Europe emerge stronger from the crisis and also become more resilient, with public investment having an extremely important role to play for this recovery. So kickstarting the economy and also mobilizing the private investment is very important in this phase. But I stop here. I'm sure we will talk more about the recovery plan as we go forward.
Indeed, I wanted to pick up on something you said in particular, that those early days when people found themselves surprised perhaps by the speed and the intensity with which the virus was spreading, and the reaction, the instinctive reaction, as you called it, was to revert to more national solutions and responses. Those difficult days at the very start proved once again how important it is to have structures in place that can facilitate cooperation. There is trust that needs to be built over years. And if those structures, like the EU institutions, are not there, that trust cannot just be recreated. How difficult was it, you think, to persuade member states that the best thing to do would be actually to work together? And did you find resistance, if I may, in that effort?
Look, I think resistance is probably not the right word, but as I was saying, it's definitely, as you also saw our president make very clear at the early stage in the crisis, and I think she did it in an extremely powerful manner on the 16th of April when she spoke in the European Parliament. Indeed, no one was really ready for this crisis, and there was not perhaps the willingness at the very beginning, or the realization that we must protect each other to protect ourselves, but that became clear very rapidly, I think, and from that moment onwards, things very rapidly changed. It didn't take long, I would say, before everyone realized in the member states, among leaders, and I can tell you, our leadership, starting with our president and also all the commissioners in the response team, they spared no effort to meet up with their colleagues very, very regularly to precisely pass this message. And I think the message got across very quickly. and member states realized that not to increase their vulnerability beyond the very, very short term, they had no choice, and it was in everyone's interest to sit down and work together to coordinate the response. And also and you saw that, and you can, by the way, see it on our website, our coronavirus website, where we have a little solidarity tracker. Member states also were rather quick in the end to mobilize solidarity and help each other, so that the flows of equipment ended up not being kept to member states themselves, but actually going to where they were most needed, in addition to for example, procurement actions and stockpiling measures that we were able to take at the European level to indeed also support the concrete health response in the member states with protective equipment, for example, ventilators and other equipment.
You mentioned briefly the effort that is now undertaken to move to the next phase, where we have to look at the damage that the pandemic has caused for our economy, but also our society, and how can we address that damage and strengthen our economic response. And I think that is another example where it becomes quickly clear that member states on their own cannot really address that damage. And this is where we need to combine our efforts as much as possible. Again, the European Commission has been at the forefront of that effort, working with member states and other EU institutions to put forward what seems to be a very ambitious, almost unprecedented in scale package for the recovery of the European economy and for the support of member states, businesses, but also citizens. It would be interesting to hear a few more details about those proposals and how do you think they're going to make an effort to strengthen the European economy and European society as a whole?
Thank you very much, Petros. Yes, indeed, we are now heading towards what needs to be a very sustained and very, very important recovery effort. And we have estimated that the investment needs actually amount to at least 1.5 trillion, be it just for the years of 2021. And these are investments in key sectors and technologies, from 5G to artificial intelligence, from everything, all these sectors, green and digital, that hold the key to Europe's future. But of course, before we do that, we have to also make sure that we can support the economy quickly and more directly, both when it comes to the member states, when it comes to business, when it comes to jobs, and when it comes to also learning the lessons of the crisis. And that's why, in addition to a revamped multi-annual financial framework that precisely insists on the areas that have been mobilized in the crisis, for example, health, for example, research, and also the ability to stockpile equipment for future crisis. We will have indeed the so-called next generation EU of 750 billion euro in terms of reinforcement, in addition to the long-term EU budget for 2027, that will bring actually the total firepower of the EU budget to 1.85 trillion. These are vertiginous numbers, of course, that need to be now negotiated with the Council and the European Parliament. But together with the three important safety nets, which were already endorsed by the European Council in April, including this very important SURE instrument to safeguard and protect jobs and businesses, it actually is a very, very exceptional package of measures that will enable us to put Europe back on the firm path of recovery. It will take a long time, but indeed, this is what is needed, and we need decisions from member states very quickly on this in order to enable this support, this investment support, because it's investment for our future and for the future generations that we're talking about here. It is not spending for let's say unproductive purposes. So communication wise, this is also something that we will need to explain and to be able to explain in the future with very concrete stories about what this package means for people who have been affected by the crisis, and how the EU can actually help them through the support instruments that are being made available through this package. So that's also why we're designing right now as we speak some a corporate campaign that you will soon see in the form of stories on many of our communication channels that will be tagged also with some of the hashtags that have become more familiar in our communication during the crisis: stronger together, EU solidarity, and united against coronavirus. So this is some of the things that we are focused on also on the communication side, as indeed we are preparing to step up the communication on this very important recovery effort that Europe collectively needs to engage on to come stronger out of the crisis.
I think the response has been quite positive to the Commission proposals. There are, of course, issues to be ironed out, and perhaps some member states don't like some elements of the proposal. But if you look at some of the press reports, at least, there is even talk of a Hamiltonian moment for Europe. Perhaps this is an exaggeration, but still, it goes to show that there was an appetite out there for the EU to step forward and do something really bold. Do you think that is that bold move that was necessary? And do you think this is a one-off or perhaps the beginning of something?
Well, surely it's the beginning of something, and it is a new phase in the integration of our union, I would say. Yeah? And indeed, we've been very encouraged by the response. Indeed, the response is also, I think, the result of the fact that very close dialogue has been conducted by the Commission's leadership with member states, and this will continue, of course, including this week, where the heads of state and government will also engage with our President von der Leyen, on this important package, indeed, so that it becomes a package, and that is the case. That is how it's been designed. That is where everyone can see themselves, and where everybody comes out a winner. Because what we are doing here, of course, in addition to supporting member states most in need, and every member state, of course, will be drawing on this huge package, and every member state, of course, both contributes and draws on the multi-annual financial framework. It's obvious that if we, for example, were not to be able to restore the level playing field, the economic activity that enables Europe to have a thriving internal market, for example, well, then everybody would feel the consequences, and all the economies in the European Union would suffer. That's just one example of why it is in everyone's interest to indeed back the package that we have proposed, a package that, of course, as is always the case, and as was already the case with the multi-annual financial framework, is a package that will be negotiated with the member states. and this is exactly what is happening now. But I think the seeing it as a collective investment, in addition to a display of solidarity, but it's solidarity in which we all have an interest. This is really what this is about, and it's about getting Europe collectively back on its foot. Because if every member state recovers, well, then every member state benefits from the recovery.
If I may, I'll take us to another subject, because as well as having to deal with the pandemic and the economic fallout from the lockdown, the EU had to also deal with another challenge, that of misinformation. Early on in the crisis, we saw the emergence of a concerted effort from a variety of corners to misinform. First and foremost, to undermine trust in science, attack established institutions as ineffective, and show a little bit of mistrust and fear in our fellow citizens. And it's something we picked up a lot through our network of offices throughout Europe. We were talking with our campaigners and activists on the ground, and we could see that in most member states and beyond, there were a lot of people that who were using social media, but also traditional media, to communicate a lot of misinformation. How did the Commission respond to that? You are in an ongoing battle, for a lack of a better word, to address this equally dangerous pandemic of misinformation. But in this particular case, it was really crucial to respond to it. What was the Commission's reaction?
You are right that in addition to the devastating pandemic that was responsible for taking so many people's lives and creating tragedies around Europe and around the world, we also faced what came to be named an infodemic. Because which actually in this particular case in some instances could be as dangerous as the virus itself, because it addressed, for example, false information about what you could do to get rid of the virus, or indeed why you should not let yourself vaccinate when this becomes a possibility, etc. Falsehoods that indeed could leave already vulnerable people completely disoriented about the right response to the crisis. So it was extremely important to deal with this. Because this was not only playing on people's fears and on their increased use of social media, but it was actually also potentially threatening public health and taking, in some instances, advantage of the situation to push an agenda that was hostile to Europe's interests. So it was in our interest very quickly to address this and to rebut, of course, immediately as many myths as we could circulating about the health aspects of the diseases, and indeed also about in some quarters a perceived lack of EU response. I mean, I've just told you a few of the initiatives that we took and all the measures that were rolled out from very early on in the crisis to support the member states' response. And also it affected the perceived lack of solidarity. So what we did, and this was also very much our president's initiative, we created a place in the anchor that we have used to inform the public throughout the crisis, our coronavirus response website, where we put indeed in a language and in a format that makes it easy to share on social media. We put as much information as we could there on the prevailing misinformation or disinformation stories that were prominent and prevailing at certain points in time. This, of course, was just one of the many measures that we took and that we are taking, because we are not starting from scratch when it comes to tackling disinformation, but we have to step it up. Perhaps you saw also our initiative last week, where our Vice President Jourova, together with the High Representative, Mr. Borrell, presented our next steps and indeed what we are doing specifically to step up the action to tackle disinformation about the coronavirus. It includes things like working in a more intensified way with the platforms, the big platforms that I have worked with us closely over the past period on developing standards and also being stronger and tighter and firmer in self-regulation. It includes funding also networks and individuals who are dedicated to finding solutions. It includes, crucially, supporting quality fact-checking and new technologies to detect early on when there's a systematic disinformation effort which is ongoing. And crucially, and this is something that Vice President Jourova feels very strongly about and on which she will take further initiatives this year, it includes improving protections for elections and indeed public information. And there's also in the External Action Service a task force that is set up to deal specifically with disinformation, as it indeed also constitutes a foreign policy threat. All this and more is covered in our communication from last week, where indeed we insist very, very much that facts matter. This is also something that really is driving the way and our approach in my team, DG Communication, in terms of how we actually work to get facts underpinning all our communication. Our coronavirus response website is an example of that. But we work indeed with online platforms, fact checkers, researchers, and of course, crucially, with member states where we also have a rapid alert system working, so that we can together very quickly coordinate if something systematic is happening and help each other address it in the most effective way. But at the end of the day, of course, the best solution for misinformation is, on one hand, also to build trust in the institutions that are legitimate and authoritative, and have a strong, resilient communications environment also, where media literacy and citizens' own ability to detect and disregard and not share false information going around is absolutely of the essence. So check out perhaps, and I say this to those who are listening to us, the Disinformation Corner on our website, and the communication from last week, if you wish to know more about what we are doing in this area.
Yeah, and one of the key tenets that we noticed, at least in our communication work, was the effort to make people feel helpless in this current crisis. But instead, we noticed a very robust response from citizens, but also organized civil society throughout the continent, came forward to help their communities, to help their neighbors, small acts of kindness or greater initiatives, either supported by the member states, EU institutions, but also from the grassroots. And I think that was very important for us, at least, as an organization that works with citizens, to bring forward what Europeans are doing every day to help each other to get over this. Because at the end of the day, that's one of the best way to respond, so that we're standing together. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, because the EU in particular has been targeted in this misinformation campaign. Like you suggested, there was a lot of implication that the EU wasn't doing enough. And in some cases, the spotlight was put on outside players, global actors, as helping more member states. This was, of course, not true, but it was something that needed to be dealt with quite quickly, again, to restore trust and confidence in the EU's response. Did your communications effort also focus a bit on putting forward, just like you did with us this morning, what the EU is doing?
Thank you, Petras. Before I go into that, let me just be also inspired of what you said about how you have yourself experienced indeed how much the action taken locally on the ground is making a difference. I couldn't agree more with that, and we're very happy that we're also able to work with you on the ground through, for example, our representations, where also disinformation in these coronavirus times has been filling a lot of space in their daily work. And the fact that they can engage with people like yourselves, the European movement on the ground, and other civil society organizations to indeed tackle this challenge together, I think is extremely important. In terms of your question on interference from the outside on misinformation and disinformation, for example. As I mentioned, the EEAS, our External Action Service, has, of course, very much this in their focus. And they, a couple of years ago already, set up a specific task force to deal with misinformation as a foreign policy issue. It was set up called the East Stratcom, and it leads the effort in fighting disinformation about the EU in neighboring countries. To the east, we are talking, of course, in addition to Russia, also Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and beyond. And the work really here focuses on communicating beyond the EU's borders by sharing both policies and messages, and also touches upon, and I mentioned it before, as important for our internal EU communication, but it's also important outside, strengthening the communications environments overall, and indeed also in addition to all the data and analysis that they're able to work on, it also produces products in multiple languages, so that indeed it tackles disinformation also with positive fact-based information on our EU policies externally. And again, I mean, there's not one single answer to disinformation. We need to act, but on the other hand, we must also be careful that we don't play into the hands, so to speak, of those who run disinformation campaigns, for example, by, and it sometimes works this way, rebutting a lie in a way that actually reinforces its impact, for example. So there's always a careful balance to observe when it comes to tackling disinformation, in addition to, of course, going after what really is systemic, what really risks damaging, let's say, the ability of our citizens to to get the facts that they deserve to be able to make informed choices, for example. So the best thing we can do here is also to encourage our citizens to think before they actually share something, and of course also supporting independent journalism is part of the answer to this.
We will be shortly taking some questions from our audience also. But while we're gathering them, I wanted to maybe move to another subject. About a year ago, we had one of the greatest democratic exercises in the world, the European elections, where European citizens showed up in great numbers to cast their vote and help decide the direction of our union. It was indeed quite a success. We saw a lot of pro-European sentiment emerging from that contest. And since then, there's been a lot of discussion on how can we continue engaging our fellow citizens in a conversation about the future of Europe. And I think the idea on the conference on the future of Europe was born out of that desire. Obviously, the health crisis we have been encountering has put that a little bit on the back burner, so to say. But I wanted to ask you, because I know you've been working on this, you and your team will be working on this quite a lot. What is the plan going forward now for the conference? And how can we use it as an opportunity, perhaps, to discuss some of the things that have emerged during the crisis? You mentioned at the beginning how far the EU's competencies allow it to go. Perhaps that is an opportunity, the conference, in consultation with stakeholders, MEPs, member states, and of course European citizens, to discuss how can we equip the EU to better protect us when it comes to things like this.
Yes, absolutely. This is extremely important, and I'm sure that many citizens will be eager to engage on these subjects. By the way, they already do, because the citizens' engagement, fortunately, even if it has had temporarily at least to take new forms, notably like we're doing here right now, Petros, together. A lot of the citizens' dialogues that we continue to organize from the Commission side and also locally, our representations, again, that I mentioned here, again, are also busy doing that. They organize digital citizens dialogues at the moment, and many of our commissioners have been conducting several of those precisely on the crisis response throughout this very difficult period. In terms of the conference on the future of Europe, which is an extremely important project that President von der Leyen was engaged strongly in already when she presented her political guidelines last year. So soon after, indeed, those European elections that saw, let's say, the European commitment of many surge, and also a much stronger participation than in the past elections of young people, which was so encouraging. This, of course, is something that, let's say, an engagement and that we need to reconnect with, I would say, after this very difficult crisis moment where also many people have asked themselves questions about what Europe needs to do more or differently in the future. And there are many lessons to learn from this crisis, as our president has also been pointing out, and translated, by the way, into proposals in the recovery plan, for example. So I think as soon as possible, the conference should be organized, and the institutions, because this is an interinstitutional project between the European Parliament and the European Parliament this week will actually be discussing the issue. And the Council and the Commission. And as soon as, indeed, on one hand, the institutions agree on a common frame for the conference, and this has obviously been delayed by the crisis because it was even envisaged that it could have taken place in May. For obvious reasons, this was not a possibility. Now the institutions will, in the near future, agree how the conference should be organized, while, of course, at the moment, we are still very much busy finding our way out of the crisis. But I'm sure, and talks are ongoing, and we are, of course, ready to engage in them, that we can soon see a plan for this, a joint declaration from the institutions. And when that comes, then we can start organizing concretely how to go about it, so that we can indeed seize this opportunity to give Europeans a stronger say in giving their views on what Europe's future should look like. This is the opportunity that our president wanted to provide citizens with through this conference, together with the other institutions. So we are, in the meantime, of course, not sitting on our hands, but continuing the preparations, so that when it becomes possible to organize this conference, we will be ready.
Fantastic. If I may follow up a little bit, because there's quite a lot of people actually taking part in this live stream discussion, and also we have picked that up in our contact with our national offices. There are a lot of engaged Europeans out there who wanna take action, who wanna be part of the European project and help strengthen it. What would you recommend to those citizens to get involved and join the discussion and play their part?
Well, first of all, it's so crucial that organizations like yourselves are active in this respect when it comes to mobilizing citizens to debate Europe and Europe's future. And we very much welcome the support that you and other civil society organizations can give, both in terms of sharing our message and Europe's efforts to tackle the crisis, because still now not enough people know about Europe's real role in the crisis, even if we are indeed communicating a lot. But not only we, the institutions, need to communicate, others also need to take their share. And with that, I also don't only think about civil society organizations, but indeed also national politicians. But I do know how much the concept of European solidarity is close to your DNA. It is, in fact, your DNA. And I'm sure that that mobilization that you and organizations like yours can give will give even greater impact in terms of getting the knowledge, the information, and the communication out about both what the Europe is doing and how much citizens' mobilization is needed. Also to reinforce and bring back, let's say, even more European spirit and more hope. Because I also think we need to give signs and evidence that there's a reason to be hopeful in these difficult times because of the way that the European Union is acting, in addition to, and I repeat it because it's very important, what member states are doing themselves. And no doubt about it, we see a lot of evidence of it these days. The trust that we saw on the rise in the context of the European elections last year surely has been in many quarters jeopardized because the fear, because of the uncertainty, and because also in some cases because people are not yet aware, and they are indeed of the European response, and they are, of course, rightly so, concerned with their future due to the economic prospects that this crisis has inflicted on all of Europe. So for all those reasons, it's also extremely important to bring out the facts on what Europe is doing in addition to the efforts of member states. So if we want Europe's as a whole to reinforce, to get stronger out of the crisis, to emerge reinforced, this of course also depends very much on the understanding of and support of the European public. And we have a very good history of cooperation, I think, the European movement and the Commission. I mentioned all the very good cooperation that is going on the ground. And indeed, you were also very active, as you always are, around our activities around the 9th of May, where precisely we had this opportunity to show Europe's action, and from a citizen's perspective, and also crucially pay tribute to this fantastic resilience of our people in Europe facing the crisis, from the health workers, of course, directly involved in saving people's lives, but also to the people who day after day, with the appropriate protection, but also willing to take the risk of going to work every day, kept Europe's supermarkets open, public transport, etc. So all those everyday heroes, they also deserve to be patted on the back, so to speak, and really to get visibility. And I think some of this communication, as we move forward in showing the benefits of the recovery plan, will be extremely important. And if you can help us make that more known, that will definitely be a benefit. And I also look forward to hearing your ideas of what we can do better and differently, because we are discussing a lot also in communication terms what lessons we can draw from the crisis.
Indeed. And you will always have a willing and able partner in the European movement in all those efforts. But speaking of partners and support, our friends have been throwing questions at us. And there is one actually that is quite interesting, and it has to do with the Western Balkans, obviously a very important region for Europe. You did mention earlier the efforts the EU made, not just the Commission made, not just to help EU member states, but also our neighbors and other partners. But in the Western Balkans, we noticed that there was a sense of a slow reaction, that the solidarity that was extended to member states didn't spill over as far as they did. And one of our viewers would like to ask, what can the EU do, and the Commission in particular, to make sure that its communication on the things that it's doing on the ground in candidate countries and others is more swift and effective, so the message can reach people beyond the EU?
It is true that there also we need to communicate more forcefully to show that we have not only been focusing on Europe, but we have actually been acting on the globally also, and showing solidarity globally in a number of ways. And without going into details, this includes actually concretely deploying 38 million euro for the Western Balkans, since this you mentioned this area specifically, and 30 million for the Eastern partnerships. I mean, I can mention things like financing ambulances, respirators, mobile X-rays, and intensive care equipment for some countries in the region, test kits, protective equipment we supplied, by the way, to Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example. We funded cargo planes to Serbia that transported 280 tons of emergency medical supplies procured by Serbia. And also in our neighborhood, namely Ukraine, we actually sent personal protective equipment and antiseptic liquid when they were in need of that. So again, I mean, with a lot of action has been taken to show solidarity also with our neighborhood, including the Western Balkans, and also more globally, helping the most vulnerable and affected in many partner countries, leading also, and we've been communicating about this as well, the efforts in the G7 and the G20. Our president has been very strongly engaged in this, in coordination, of course, with the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and of course, closely working, as we've done throughout this crisis, with the World Health Organization. So there's a big strand of action also going on, following this Team Europe approach that we are very keen to embrace, where we combine the resources that we have from the European Union, its member states, financial institutions, including, of course, crucially, the European Investment Bank, and also the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So it's a global effort that we're leading, in addition to, of course, focusing very strongly on the European recovery that needs to start now.
Perfect. I have another one from our audience, and it's actually quite pertinent one, because obviously nothing will be the same after this. We're in a new normal kind of a world. And one of our viewers is asking, how will EU communications look different after Corona? Are there lessons to draw from as we go forward, and as we're planning how to engage and communicate Europe to our fellow citizens?
I think, as I said, we are busy drawing lessons and analyzing what we need to do differently and better. I think if you take one of the issues that we discussed already, namely on misinformation and disinformation, I think it's very, very clear that we need to be, let's say, engaging even more on social media than we already do today. And we have, believe me, considerably reinforced our efforts over the past years in sync with with global trends. And of course, everybody seemed to be communicating much more on social media. But it's not about only communicating and putting the facts and the message out. It's also the ability to engage better, to know with whom to engage, to be present in the right communities where the discussions are taking place or where the misinformation is rife. This is something that I believe personally that we need to focus on much more in coming months and years, as indeed our Vice President said last week when she presented the communication on disinformation together with the High Representative. So this is one of the areas, one of several, I would say, where we will need to strengthen our hand, of course, with the resources that we have, because they are, as you well know, not unlimited, but we will definitely prioritize this area very strongly, in addition to the citizens' engagement that we also just discussed.
Yes. There's one more, and it links a little bit to what you just said. It has to do with traditional media. Obviously, newspapers and magazines have been under a lot of pressure from new media. Their overall business model has been challenged. And over the last few months, due to the crisis, we have seen also a lot of pressure on independent journalism. How can the EU institutions, member states, support free press, independent journalism in these difficult times to make sure that they continue to perform the very important role they play in our society?
Well, one of the obvious ways that the service that I'm responsible for is supporting independent media is to have a very clear and transparent policy of informing the media and enabling independent media, because this is what media needs to be. They cannot take neither orders or instructions from anyone. They really have to be able to play their role independently. So we have a very strong, and I want to pay tribute to them actually. I've been working with them for many years, first as a spokesperson, but now also indirectly as Director General for DG Communication. We have a very strong and very committed group of journalists in Brussels that have done every day during the crisis, and also in different and altered working conditions, an enormous amount of work to inform critically, as they always do, independently, the citizens of Europe about the coronavirus crisis in Europe and the European response to the crisis, analyzing it from different angles. And we want to make sure that they can continue to do that. And therefore, it's also, and you've seen our spokesperson, our chief spokesperson in the press room every day, together with the team of spokesperson, we've set up a virtual press room informing the media here, taking questions from the accredited journalists. So that group of independent media is absolutely essential, and I want to pay tribute to them and the work that they are doing. And across Europe and in the world, of course, independent media is something that we strongly believe in. You've also heard from Vice President Jourova and our own president on this in the past. And supporting also in the context of disinformation that I mentioned, independent media in different ways, also through fact-checking networks which are independent, etc., are one of the ways to do it. In addition, of course, to defending, and this you can always count on the European Union and the Commission to do, the values of indeed independent media, and as an essential part of our democracy and keeping democracy alive and vibrant in Europe. So supporting very directly, of course, independent media, supporting the activities that they do, for example, to fight disinformation, and defending staunchly the values that guarantee freedom of expression and media freedom in Europe are some of the ways in which we can continue to defend the role of media, which is crucial for our democracy, for European democracy indeed.
True. And perhaps this is a fitting way to conclude our discussion. There's plenty more questions, and we could perhaps continue talking until the late hours, but time is precious and there's a lot that you have to do. The one thing left for me is to, first of all, thank you for taking the time and answering honestly and bravely our questions. Thank all of those of you who have joined in the conversation. And I want to leave you with one message, that this crisis has shown that we are stronger when we are indeed standing together. And the more we pool our resources and the more we cooperate, the easier it will be to get through these difficult times and be together again. Please stay tuned. We'll be having many more discussions like this. Many thanks again to Pia and the whole team behind you for all the work that they put to make this happen. And we're looking forward to working with you in the future and seeing you again. Have a good morning.
Likewise. Thank you very much.